Hi, I'm Benjamin Miss, and today we're going to be talking about learning and conditioning. We see here, we have a lot of understanding when we talk about learning, about what's this bell ringing, what does this actually mean? Well, this is part of our introduction to psychology, and it's one of the most fundamental components. When we look at what it means to do, learning and conditioning, we're talking about some, really old and really still quite valid and useful ideas in psychology, things that are applied on a regular basis. And we see these things, what are these, what does it mean to push a lever? Why are we talking about rats doing these things? And the answer is how fundamental it is. So our goals here are really trying to understand how learning works, and specifically we cannot be done, we do not understand this unless we can explain classical and operant conditioning, specifically how it works. And there's a lot of misunderstandings and myths that go with this. A lot of this is based on the branch of psychology called behaviorism. Behaviorism was dominant in the first, really into the middle of the 20th century. Really nice impact in terms of everything's learned, therefore we should focus on learning and rehabilitation. But they completely ignored the mind. The mind didn't matter. Basically, the only thing that did matter, the only thing worth focusing on was the behavior. So we're looking at, all right, what are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are the what's the stimulus and what's the response? Right? That's the SR model, stimulus response. And the two main types of conditioning are classical and operant. And so what this looks at is the components. So we start with classical conditioning. Here you see you've got the dog, and when you give the dog food, the dog drools and salivates because there's food. The bell does nothing. When you give food and ring the bell, or ring the bell and immediately follow it with food, the dog will create this connection in its mind that means the bell means food is coming. So this unconditioned response, this salivation due to food, gets paired to the bell. So it's part of a learning process. You've now learned that something that's not related is connected. And we have these classical conditioning learning things happening all the time where two things that aren't related become connected because of certain experiences. Perhaps a certain cologne or perfume of someone that you know or care about, you associate with that person. And then you're out somewhere and you smell it and you start thinking about that person, or you start, like, oh, is this, that person? Basically, we're connecting unrelated things in a way that creates a very powerful connection. And there's a lot of ways this can work. The Pavlov's classical study involved an accident. Pavlov observed that his dogs, he was studying salivation. He wasn't interested in conditioning until he had this really interesting insight, which was the dogs would start to salivate before the food got there. They had associated the process, the footsteps, the setup to being fed. And so he started to uncover these laws of learning quite accidentally, right? Simply by paying attention to how the process was happening. A lot of really cool discoveries are made that way. You're looking for something and something happens and it's unexpected and you investigate it. And that's what Pavlov did. And that's really the great part of the genius of, understanding and discovering classical conditioning. Let's consider other things. You can find lots of videos on classical conditioning. You see it in TV shows where they learn to pair things that aren't related. If you were to, you condition somebody by pairing two things, like if you were to, do something innocuous like snap your fingers and then yell really loud, right, to like startle someone, and then every time you snapped your fingers, you'd then yell really loud, how long would it take before snapping your fingers would cause that person to just get annoyed and prepare for some kind of loud, annoying response? So the unconditioned stimulus in the unconditioned response, right? That's the yelling and somebody like, getting upset, gets paired. The unconditional stimulus gets paired. The unconditioned stimulus gets paired with the conditioned stimulus, which is the, snapping of the fingers, right? So normally snapping your fingers wouldn't make someone be like, stop yelling. But you get that kind of connection between those two things. Now, that's our classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is nice and pretty clear. Operant, and it's used in a lot of ways. Operant conditioning, however, is a very powerful technique paired with people like, Thorndike and Skinner, and especially, Skinner, one of the later behaviorists, in how we can actually condition people by reinforcing or punishing behavior. Sometimes reinforcement is called reward, okay? But usually it's referred to as reinforcement because reinforcement depends on the organism, whatever the organism experiences as something that it wants. So here is, for instance, positive reinforcement, the most common one. In fact, the most useful. And then we get into, and I'm going to say this now, we're going to look at it, negative reinforcement, positive punishment. These are two concepts that are complex and often misunderstood. Never get it, never make the mistake, okay? Because there's we see it in popular media. I've seen a lot of people get this wrong. So there's on the show The Big Bang Theory, there was a scene where one of the characters was trying to condition another character, right? The kind of weird guy was trying to condition the girl who was dating the other guy. Anyways, if you're familiar with the show, Sheldon was trying to condition Penny, and basically anytime she did something that he approved of, he would give her chocolate. And the whole kind of joke about it was, it works. You can really influence people by reinforcing their behavior. If you find out what someone likes, and every time they do something that you like, you do something to reinforce that behavior. Learning works extremely well this way. Reinforcement is much better than punishment. Now, if you like chocolate and someone gives you chocolate when you do something they like, this is called positive reinforcement, okay? Because you have reinforced a behavior, right? You have kind of taught someone that doing this is good. Now, we look at what's called negative reinforcement and positive punishment and how we get those things confused. So let me go through some questions, and I want you to think about the questions and think about how we answer these. So what is the chocolate? I just said this, pretty straightforward. The chocolate is positive reinforcement. Okay, now there's an unedited version of the clip. You can find where they cut things out, but the character sprays the other character in the face and says "Bad Leonard" and sprays him in the face with a spray bottle, right? You've probably seen people use this technique with animals, basically like a deterrent, like you do something negative, you get sprayed. Well, he refers to it as negative reinforcement, but it's not. But a lot of people think that it is. Right. Now, the writers of the show were, physicists, chemists. They weren't, engineers. They weren't necessarily social scientists, so they don't understand the laws of learning. And so, it's still funny. But what is it? Negative reinforcement. We often think of negative reinforcement. We think it's because negative sounds bad, like, oh, it's negative. You don't want this, which is actually false. Here's how reinforcement and punishment works. Negative reinforcement is good. You want negative reinforcement. Positive punishment is bad. I know, it sounds positive, but it's bad. So if someone sprays you in the face, do you want that? No, I mean, probably not. Um, so then it becomes, what is it? What is this um, being sprayed? Well, it's actually positive punishment, and here's why. Positive in psychology doesn't mean good, and negative doesn't mean bad, right? Necessarily. Another example is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has what are called positive and negative symptoms, but none of them are good. Positive are things that shouldn't be there, like delusions and hallucinations. Negative are things that are missing from a typical person's experience, like a flat affect, where not responding emotionally to things, like this missing connection. So positive means adding, and negative means taking away. So if I'm spraying you with water, right, and saying no, is this something that you want? No. So it's going to be punishment, right? So am I adding something or taking something away? I'm adding something. I'm adding the water. So getting sprayed is actually positive punishment. What would actually be negative reinforcement? Giving shocks, taking away a favorite toy, giving someone a present, or taking away an unpleasant chore? Well, the answer is taking away an unpleasant chore. Negative reinforcement is basically doing something to make you happy by taking something away. And that's why it's so complicated for people. It's like this, like a sentence with like a triple negative in it or something, right? Negative reinforcement is something that you want. It means removing something to reinforce your behavior. So think about it. What do you have that you don't want? Well, let's say that you have some, extra duties to do at work, right, that you don't particularly like, and your boss says, "Wow, you've been working so hard, you did a great job. You don't have to do those things, today or this week." And you're like, "Awesome!" You were reinforced by having something taken away. The unpleasant chore. Let's say your job is to, sweep the patio, and it's just annoying, and it takes time, and it's cold, and you don't want to do it. And so you do a good job, and you get good grades, and when you're in school and your parents say, "Great job, I'm proud of you, you don't have to do that chore today." That's negative reinforcement. Negative means taking something away. Reinforcement means, hey, I like that behavior, do that behavior more. Okay? So taking away a favorite toy, or let's say you did something, when you were in high school, like you took the car and you weren't supposed to, and you got in trouble, and your parents took away your phone, for a few days. What would that be? Well, are we adding or taking away? We're taking away, right? We're taking something away, and therefore, is this something you want, right? Is this to punish you or to reinforce you? Well, it's to punish you because you did something you weren't supposed to do. So it would be negative punishment. Taking away your phone because you did something you weren't supposed to do would be negative punishment. And there's some exercises, really useful exercises you can do with this. For instance, think about how you would motivate a child to do better through all of these techniques. And a lot of they're going to be adding things or taking things away to either reinforce or punish. A kid gets bad grades, you want to be like, no, some kind of punishment, right? But you also want to reinforce good behavior, right? So when the kid studies and then works extra hard, you want to do something to reinforce that behavior. And you can do this through positive reinforcement, giving them something, negative reinforcement, taking away something they don't want, positive punishment, adding something they don't want, right? Like extra chores, or negative punishment, taking away a toy or a phone or a privilege. So these are all ways that learning works. Now, what's particularly interesting to note is positive reinforcement works the best, right? And punishment doesn't work that well. So when you think about, working with kids, people tend to go for punishment, right? You see things like spanking. There is a lot of research that says physical punishment is always bad and doesn't have long-term beneficial outcomes and has specifically negative long-term outcomes, right? The kid doesn't learn to self-regulate. They don't learn good behaviors. They just learn what was wrong. Positive reinforcement helps to teach what those behaviors are. What's interesting too about this is when we talk about this or child development, people will argue, no, my parents spanked me and it was good. But there's a lot of other things to unpack there. So this is something that you have to do, right? You're, a psychology student, and when someone says negative reinforcement and they mean punishment, you're like, oh no. But that's how important this is. You can expect any assignment, any test on material like this is going to require a firm understanding of negative reinforcement. So hopefully we've reached a point where we're knowledgeable and comfortable with this. When we look at reinforcement issues, we know that early on, you really want to connect the reinforcement or punishment to the event, right? So whatever it is. A classic example of this is you go out to work, your dog poops inside, right? And someone yells at the dog, comes home, yells at the dog, and rubs their face in the poop. Okay. Completely useless. All that dog learned is you're weird and why are you being a jerk, right? The dog doesn't want to sniff their own poop. They want to sniff the other dog's poop. So it's very confusing because it's not connected, right? Plus, if the dog went inside, it probably needed to go outside and wasn't able to do so, or there was some other issue going on. Punishment in this case, not particularly useful. Only if you literally caught the dog pooping inside, and then you know what's better? Pull them outside really fast. Be like, this is where we go, not inside, right? And teach them what the appropriate behavior is. Now, we also talk about consistency. Do you have to reinforce every time? And the answer is no. However, early on, we absolutely want to, right? So especially for children, animals, you want to start off with regular reinforcement and then you taper off. Things like potty training, for paper training, for children, for dogs, however you do this, you want to have very early on a lot of reinforcement. Now, there's two types of reinforcers, primary and secondary. Our primary reinforcers are things that are innate. So what is going to reinforce you every time and you're going to want it, right? Usually for almost everybody, there's some food item that you just love. And when and it's like a very positive thing. Food is innately reinforcing. Part of the reason we are have such issues with overeating is food is reinforcing to humans because for most of our existence it took a lot of work to get enough calories, and we didn't have things like refined sugars and grains that were easily accessible and very easy to put on weight. So these things are very reinforcing. Now, secondary reinforcers are learned. So an interesting thing that's learned in terms of these are like money, right? Money, a piece of green paper does nothing for you, right? But knowing that this is money and has value, you've learned through, oh, I like food, I like entertainment, I like toys, I use this money to pay for these things. It becomes a reinforcer through classical conditioning. And there's a lot of training techniques that use this. There's these little clickers they use with dogs with training. And so the dog does the thing that the person wants and they get the little click. But the click by itself isn't reinforcing. In the beginning when they get that click, you have to give them a treat. And then the click itself becomes reinforcing. But you still have to sometimes give them a treat paired with the click so they know, hey, I did a good job. And this is using classical conditioning to aid in operant conditioning. Different reinforcement schedules. So you have these kind of outcomes, right? These kind of things that you want. So fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. A ratio is a certain portion. So let's say every 4 times you get, that you do something, you get a treat. Okay, that's the fixed ratio. The variable ratio is on average every 4 times. You may go 6 times and then get a treat, and then 1 and then get a treat, but it'll average out to every 4 times you get a treat. Fixed interval means a rat's pushing a lever, and after every 10 seconds it gets rewarded. Variable interview is on average every 10 seconds you get rewarded, but you have a you don't know how long that is, right? Now, what these things tell us is you have different performance based on how you're being reinforced. For all of these, we're talking about positive reinforcement. We're talking about the rat is pushing a lever and food is coming out. For your variable ratio, you have the highest number of responses because the rat knows that it doesn't know when the next one's coming, but it knows that the more it pushes, the more it gets. With fixed ratio, you get a slower rate, which seems odd, but the rat knows that it's got to do 4 times before it gets a response. So after it gets the response, after it gets what it wants, it pauses, right? It pauses for a moment because now it's got to go through the process again. Variable interval, it doesn't know how, when it's going to get the response, but it slows down a little bit because speed doesn't seem to matter. And fixed interval, it's not going to respond. It's going to learn, oh, I'm just going to wait 10 seconds, then hit the lever. So it's not really going to hit the lever all that much. These are classic ideas of reinforcement, and it helps us to understand how learning works. The takeaway here is variable ratio. If you want to reinforce behavior, if you want, a child or an animal or a person or whatever to learn, you want to use a variable ratio of reinforcement, which means early on, right? We want the timing to be consistent and fast and behavior response. Potty training. Kid has to go potty, runs to the bathroom and makes it just in time. And you're like, this is amazing. As soon as that kid's done, boom, treats. After a while, fewer and fewer. The kid has learned, you don't have to reinforce. But you don't reinforce every time when you get that behavior. You're teaching a dog tricks, right? You're putting these pieces together. Variable reinforcement, right? Sometimes they get the treat, sometimes they don't. Now, but they're always getting some kind of way of knowing that they did what was wanted. Okay, shaping is reinforcing behavior that is similar to the behavior you want. And this is the example with, for instance, training a dog. So when you're training a dog, you look at movies and TV, you want the dog to run across the floor, jump up on the couch, put its paws on the armrest, and then wag its tail and bark, right? Well, you can't say to the dog, okay, dog, here's what I want you to do. You got to get it to do some of those behaviors and reinforce as it does that. So whenever the dog runs, right, you start off and the dog runs in the direction you want, you reinforce it. It runs and jumps on the couch, you reinforce it. You keep starting over. And then it runs and jumps on the couch and accidentally puts its paws on the armrest. Awesome, reinforce it, right? So then the dog eventually does it again, reinforce it. Until you got the whole thing together, right? Until you get the whole thing together. That's shaping. It's a little bit at a time until it knows. Now we think about what is called escape conditioning and avoidance conditioning. And we're going to come back to how these things work because they're really quite interesting. So with escape conditioning, you put a dog in a box and you shock just 1/2 of the box. And what's the dog going to do? It's going to jump over to the other side. And then you see this kind of thing with students who drop out of school, escape conditioning. For instance, if school sucks for you, if you don't feel like you're learning a lot, then this is going to be kind of what you do, right? Is this escape conditioning. You get out and then you feel better. Avoidance conditioning is when you do something to avoid a situation that you don't like, and this involves, classical conditioning also, right? Where you have the conditioned stimulus, avoiding your doctor, right? Avoiding the dentist, for instance, because you feel better when you avoid. All right, now, how is this being used? If you have a casino and you want people to lose their money, you want them to play the slot machine a lot. So what kind of reinforcement schedule are you going to use? Fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, or variable interval? And the answer is variable ratio. This had the highest number of responses. Think about how a variable ratio works. If you buy food at a snack machine, right? You put money in and food doesn't come out. Are you going to keep putting money in? No. But you know how slot machines work at casinos. So you go to a casino and you put money in a slot machine, it doesn't pay you. You put more money in, you're like, this time, it doesn't pay you. I would wonder if it would even be legal to put machines in casinos that never, ever paid out. And people would keep putting money in because that's how they work. You're waiting for that big payout. If someone steals and is sentenced to receive 20 lashes, I know, right? Quite barbaric. What type of conditioning is this? Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment? The answer is positive punishment. And again, this sounds odd to us because you say, well, the punishment's not positive. I don't want to get hit. But the issue is, it is about the adding something that you don't want. How about somebody steals and they're not allowed to eat, right? This is, both of these things are horrible torture, but they're illustrative. What is this? Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, and the answer is negative punishment, taking away something that you want in order to punish a behavior. The child is good, so her parents tell her she doesn't have to do her chores. What type of conditioning is this? And this is negative reinforcement. And that's the one, again, that people get confused with positive punishment because we think, no, but this is good, it's not bad. But negative doesn't mean bad, it means taking away. Here are some examples of the laws of learning. And here we're talking about classical conditioning. So classical conditioning works over this process of acquisition, where you learn the connection, followed by extinction. So extinction happens if you were to give the stimulus over and over, right, the conditioned stimulus, without the unconditioned stimulus, right? So they're getting just the conditioned stimulus. So think of the classic example of Pavlov's dog and the bell. So the dog is given food and ring the bell. Ring the bell, given food. Ring the bell, given food. Ring the bell, given food. Same time. Then they just start ringing the bell. The dog salivates. No food. Ring the bell. Salivates. No food. Ring the bell. Salivates. No food. Eventually the dog's going to stop salivating. It's going to be like, no. The bell is just a bell. However, after a period of time with no bell, ringing that bell will cause the salivation again. Classical conditioning never really goes away. It's always going to be there. That connection is always going to be there. Now here is our example again with the dog in the shuttle box, right, where you shock one half. So you put the shock on only the part where the dog is, and the dog's going to jump over, right? So and you think about how powerful this is. If you were to put the dog on that shock part, and you see that little light there, the way this works is they turn a little light on to warn the dog the shock is coming, right? So this is a classical conditioning thing. So light goes on, dog gets shocked. The next time the light goes on, that dog jumps over to the other side before the shock happens. But what is interesting about this is, and why it's so difficult to get extinction, is the dog, you can stop shocking that side forever. As soon as you turn that light on, that dog's jumping. You never have to shock that side again. The dog does not want to go back there. So the same thing with jumping out of school. Somebody has a bad experience, it doesn't work for them, and then a couple years go by, they develop better learning techniques, they develop some more kind of self-discipline, but they're never going to go back because they associate it so negatively that they're not going to put themselves in that situation which was painful for them, even though the situation has changed. And the idea of being highly resistant to extinction is, you put that light on, that dog's jumping. How would you get it to learn that you don't have to do that anymore? It would be restraining the dog in that position where they were shocked and turning the light on. The dog's going to whimper and try to get away, and no shock's going to happen. And the dog's going to be like, where's the shock? And the dog is learning now that there is no shock and that it is just, no escape, is necessary. But you have to prevent the escape response. You have to force the organism to stay in that situation. Now, learned helplessness is another concept from here. If you were to restrain the dog and shock it, right, it would just lie down and whine. Now, what would happen if you shocked both sides? This is learned helplessness. You shock both sides. So the dog jumps over and it's still getting shocked. It jumps back, it's still getting shocked. Eventually, the dog's just going to give up and cry whenever you shock it, which is, yes, it is as horrible as it sounds. So you put the dog where you shock it. You shock both sides. Eventually, the dog gives up. You stop shocking the other side, but the dog has learned that going there doesn't matter. So it doesn't even try. It just whimpers and gives up. I know, super sad. That sucks. Well, how do they get amazing, powerful, difficult to control creatures like elephants to to basically do what they want? Well, when the elephant is a baby, they wrap a heavy rope or chain around its leg that's so strong that the elephant will try to get away and it'll just dig in and be painful. And yes, it is as horrible as it sounds. As soon as the rope is tied around the ankle of the adult elephant, it just gives up. It has learned that rope means it can't escape. So you'll see this huge elephant with a very small rope around its ankle, and it's learned that it can't get away, so it doesn't try, even though that adult elephant could stomp all those terrible people who've treated it so horribly. Nothing could stop it. But because it learned that it didn't have that ability when it was, a baby elephant and weaker, it's learned that it can't do anything. You think about the student who's learned that he won't be successful, that he can't be successful, right? It takes very little to hold them back now. You've had any bad experiences in the classroom, maybe as a child, growing up in school, maybe there's a subject that was bad for you or a teacher that was bad. That can have these long lasting effects, learning I can't be successful. Now, after extinction, after learning that the bell by itself doesn't mean food is coming. Spontaneous recovery means it comes back. Disinhibition means that the response, once you've learned a classical conditioned response, it is never unlearned. It is only inhibited, which is quite a bit of work. So once you've learned that you can't do something, that's how it is. Okay? And now, let's see how these things fit together. This increases the probability that a behavior will happen again. Is it reinforcement or is it punishment? What increases the probability that the behavior will happen again? It is reinforcement. Now, what makes something a reinforcer depends on the organism. I mentioned you need to find out if you're trying to train another organism, you need to find out what it responds to, because it is what it wants. What it wants is going to be that thing. When you look at punishment, right, I told you punishment only temporarily changes behavior, and Punishment is frequently ineffective. It's got to be right away. The individual can't be able to leave the situation, and it can really have some long-term negative effects unless the organism can understand it. A child who doesn't really understand why they're being punished, it may feel bad, feel something's wrong with them, not understanding it was behavior or a situation. So punishment is generally problematic. It doesn't teach what the right behavior is. It just teaches, bad. Getting paid at work is what type of reinforcement schedule for most people? For most people, right, who get a paycheck, get a regular paycheck every 2 weeks, let's say, what type of reinforcement schedule is this? Fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, or variable interval? It's fixed interval, every 2 weeks, getting paid. If you, how could you improve performance by changing this? A student gets high scores and the teacher tells her she doesn't have to take the final. What is this? Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. This is negative reinforcement. Taking and assuming the student doesn't want to take the final. Taking away something the student doesn't want. You ignore your friend because they made fun of you in front of others. First of all, not a cool friend, but what is it when you ignore them? Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. Well, assuming that your friend wants your attention, you are taking away something they want, right? So they don't want you to take away their attention, which makes it negative punishment. So a couple other ways to look at reinforcement schedules. We've got continuous reinforcement, which is every time the behavior occurs, you get reinforced, and you've got partial reinforcement, right? Partial reinforcement tends to work better because eventually you can eat so much chocolate, you're like, you know what, I don't need the behavior right now, I'm good, right? So you want to kind of reinforce on a partial schedule, right? Those things that we saw. And we also have two more concepts here, stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. So what these are is stimulus generalization means that you are seeing two stimuli similarly enough that you're responding to it. So let's say the bell, you ring a bell and the dog salivates. You ring a slightly different bell and the dog also salivates. But now you bang a gong, right, and the dog doesn't salivate. That's stimulus discrimination. So the animal has learned these are similar, these are different, and that's how you're able to kind of see. So you think about it, how are you able to tell if a species perceives something as complex as this? And the answer is you test them. You see if they think these two stimuli are similar or different. Now we consider the laws of learning in regards to one of the big issues with behaviorism was it didn't care what was going on inside the organism. But what happened was they saw that in terms of learning, organisms were learning even without reinforcement. So do you need to be reinforced every time in order to learn? And the answer is, of course not. I mean, some of this is going to be internal. You might learn just to learn. Think about you go to a new school or you move somewhere. You're going to learn the area. You're not being reinforced necessarily. So here was Tolman's rats. It's called latent learning that remains hidden until it's useful. So here's the maze, right? So the rat would be dropped in, and it would have these doors and curtains to go through and kind of learn its map around the maze. So you put the rat in the maze, and it's going to run and try to find its way through until eventually it finds the the end. Well, there were three groups of rats. One group, I should say, just roamed through the maze once a day for 17 days. No reinforcement or whatever. One group was reinforced with food every time they reached the end. And the interesting group, or another group was never reinforced, and the interesting group was reinforced only after day 11. So 10 days of roaming through the maze without reinforcement. What do you think happened? On day 12, how well did that group do? Did they start learning the same way the rats that had been new learned, or did they already know? And the answer is no, they got it. Like they got it right away. So basically, they figured out that these rats had this latent learning. They didn't have to be reinforced every time because it was beneficial. It was interesting to them. They wanted to learn. So you got this this green line. These were the rats that were rewarded every time, right? They got food whenever they finished the maze. The red group, they never got food. They just kind of wandered through and made a lot of errors. However, the blue line here is the group that got rewarded only on day 11. And by day 12, they were performing just as well, if not better, than the group that was reinforced from day 1. The idea being they're learning without reinforcement. We're all learning. We don't need necessarily the external. There's internal rewards, there's internal drives. Not everything has to be reinforced in order to be learned. I mean, it isn't a huge problem. It doesn't mean behaviorism is wrong. It just means that there are things going on inside the organism that are interesting and useful in terms of understanding how these processes work. And when we look at other ways of learning, we also know that there's things like insight learning. We've got our heuristics and our biases and how these things go. And we'll kind of go through a little bit about how these things function. Things like taste aversion. You ever eat something and immediately you become ill, and you've learned through one trial, through classical conditioning, pairing that thing with the illness, not to eat that food, right? Learn vicariously by observing another organism get punished. You go to school and you see another kid, throw something across the room, and the kid gets told to, go stand in the hall, and they're punished, and they call their parents, and you learn, I don't want to do that because that sucks, right? So you learn these kinds of things too. Or a kid, does a really good job and answers questions, and the teacher gives them, extra stuff, extra privileges. That's how this works, right? So we're learning in this way. And then we also learn through this observation. We see how other people behave. And the classic example here is Bandura. This is Bandura's learned aggression, where the kids saw an adult hitting a doll, and then some kids went to play in that room without a doll, and other kids were playing in the room with the doll. Some kids saw the doll in the room without being shown the video, and they just kind of avoided the doll or played with it normally. But the kids who saw the video imitated the adult and attacked the doll and played violently with it, right? Suggesting that there may be some copying of this. It's a very interesting area, a lot of debate about it, but it is clear that kids are going to imitate. Well, this is going to end our discussion of learning and conditioning. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I look forward to future discussions. Thank you.